In the gilded corridors of European power, where dynasties rose and fell on the ambitions of men, one monarch stood apart, not for his conquests or his wisdom, but for the darkness that consumed him from within. Philip V of Spain ruled for nearly half a century, yet history remembers him not as a king of glory, but as a man whose obsession with his wives transformed love into a prison, devotion into madness, and monarchy into a slow-motion catastrophe. This is the story of a sovereign who ruled half the world while being utterly ruled by his own demons, a tale of grief, possession, and a descent into madness so complete that it haunted an entire nation for 40 years. The year was 1683, when Philip was born into the House of Bourbon at the Palace of Versailles, the second son of Louis, the Grand Dauphin of France, and thus grandson to the Sun King himself, Louis XIV. From his earliest days, Philip was not destined for greatness. That honor belonged to his older brother. The young prince grew in the shadow of Versailles' overwhelming splendor, surrounded by the mechanical precision of court life, the endless rituals, and the suffocating expectations of European royalty. Yet even as a child, servants and tutors noticed something unsettling about the boy. He was withdrawn, silent for hours at a time, his eyes distant and unfocused, as though he existed in a world parallel to our own, but could never quite touch it. Where other princes learned statecraft and military strategy with enthusiasm, Philip retreated into himself. He showed no interest in the games of power that animated the court, no curiosity about the vast territories his family controlled. His tutors reported that the prince could sit motionless for entire afternoons, staring at nothing, responding to questions only after long, uncomfortable pauses. The only person who seemed able to reach him was his mother, Marie Anne of Bavaria. Philip clung to her with an intensity that troubled even the permissive standards of royal child-rearing. He would follow her through the palace corridors, silent as a ghost, and if separated from her for even brief periods, would descend into inconsolable fits of weeping and trembling that could last for hours. The courtiers whispered that the prince was touched by melancholy, that strange affliction of the soul that physicians could neither explain nor cure. Some suggested it was a family curse. The Habsburgs, from whom his grandmother descended, were known for their peculiarities, their intermarriages having produced generations of unstable minds and malformed bodies. Others believed young Philip had inherited his great-grandmother's famous melancholia, that existential sadness that no amount of luxury or power could dispel. But whatever its origin, the darkness in Philip's soul was already taking root, sending tendrils through his psyche that would eventually strangle everything he touched. When Philip was 14, his mother died suddenly. The effect on the young prince was catastrophic. Witnesses reported that he did not cry at first. Instead, he stood motionless at her deathbed for nearly a full day, refusing food, water, or sleep, his eyes fixed on her lifeless face, as though by sheer will he could command her to return. When finally pulled away by concerned servants, Philip collapsed into a state that physicians described as a living death. For weeks, he remained in his chambers, speaking to no one, eating barely enough to survive, his eyes hollow and his face pale as a corpse. The vibrant world of Versailles continued its endless dance of power and pleasure, but in his dark room, Philip had already begun his descent into the abyss that would define his reign. The young prince might have remained a footnote in history, a tragic curiosity confined to the shadows of the French court. But fate had other plans. In November 1700, King Charles II of Spain died without an heir, and Europe held its breath. The Spanish Empire was the greatest prize in Christendom. Territories spanning from the Americas to the Philippines, wealth beyond measure, and power that could tip the balance of the continent. Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, had been a tragic figure himself, so inbred that he could barely speak or walk, his body a testament to generations of incestuous marriages designed to keep power within the family. On his deathbed, Surrounded by priests and politicians, he named Philip, Duke of Anjou, as his heir. At just 17 years old, Philip found himself thrust onto one of Europe's most powerful thrones. The boy who could barely function without his mother, who had spent his adolescence in near catatonic grief, was now expected to rule an empire that stretched across the globe. King Louis XIV of France, recognizing both the opportunity and the danger, orchestrated Philip's departure from Versailles with calculated precision. The young king was dressed in Spanish fashion, surrounded by Spanish advisors, and sent across the Pyrenees to claim his inheritance. But before he left, his grandfather issued a warning that would prove prophetic. "Be a good Spaniard. That is now your first duty, but remember, you were born a Frenchman." Philip would succeed at neither. The journey to Madrid was a nightmare for the fragile young king. Away from the familiar corridors of Versailles, deprived of the routines that had structured his existence, Philip descended into panic. His attendants reported that he wept openly during the journey, that he had to be coaxed from his carriage at each stop, that he trembled uncontrollably when faced with crowds who had gathered to see their new monarch. When finally he arrived in Madrid in February 1701, the Spanish court was shocked by what they saw. This was no confident young sovereign ready to lead them into a new golden age, but a pale, shaking boy whose eyes darted nervously around the throne room, who flinched at sudden movements, and who seemed perpetually on the verge of fleeing back to France. The Spanish nobility, accustomed to the spectral presence of Charles II, had hoped for better. Instead, they received a king who could barely speak during his own coronation, who had to be prompted by advisors for every response, who looked as though he might collapse at any moment. But Louis XIV and his advisors had anticipated this problem. They understood that Philip could not rule alone. He needed an anchor, someone to cling to, someone who could channel his desperate need for attachment into something that resembled governance. The solution was marriage, and they had already selected the bride, Maria Louisa Gabriella of Savoy, a young princess barely 13 years old, beautiful, cultured, and entirely unprepared for what awaited her. Maria Louisa arrived in Spain in September 1701, and the wedding was celebrated with all the pageantry the court could muster. The young bride was everything the court had hoped for: graceful, intelligent, and possessed of that innate political sense that seemed to skip entire generations in royal bloodlines. She spoke multiple languages, understood the complex web of European alliances, and showed genuine interest in the welfare of her new subjects. The Spanish people, desperate for stability after the grotesque spectacle of Charles II's reign, embraced her with genuine affection. But Maria Louisa's triumph would be short-lived, for she had not married a king, she had married a prison, and Philip would be her jailer. From their wedding night, Philip's attachment to his young bride crossed from devotion into pathology. He refused to let her out of his sight, not for a moment, not for any reason. Court protocol dictated that the king and queen maintain separate apartments, that they appear together for formal occasions, but otherwise pursue their own interests and activities. Philip destroyed these conventions within days. Maria Louisa was moved into his chambers, her own apartments left empty and silent. Every moment of her day was spent in his presence. When he ate, she sat beside him. When he met with ministers, she was there. When he slept, she lay next to him, often kept awake by his nightmares and the muttering that would continue through the darkness. The young queen quickly realized the horror of her situation. She was not a wife, but a talisman, a living charm against the demons that haunted her husband's mind. Courtiers reported hearing Philip's voice through the palace walls at night, sometimes crying, sometimes screaming, sometimes whimpering like a child, and always Maria Louisa's softer voice trying to soothe him, to talk him back from whatever edge he was approaching. During the day, she performed her duties with extraordinary grace, but those close to her noticed the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching, the increasing pallor of her complexion. Ministers and ambassadors found themselves in absurd situations. They would arrive for scheduled meetings with the king, only to wait for hours outside his chambers, while Philip refused to emerge without his wife. Sometimes Maria Luisa would be ill, suffering from the constant stress and lack of rest, but Philip would insist she be carried to wherever he needed to be, unable to function in her absence. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting became accustomed to the bizarre ritual of dressing her while Philip watched, refusing to leave the room, his eyes following her every movement with an intensity that made everyone uncomfortable. The court physicians were consulted, but 17th century medicine had little to offer a mind as fractured as Philip's. They prescribed the usual remedies, bloodletting, purgatives, special diets, but nothing touched the core of his disorder. The king's grandfather in France received regular reports and grew increasingly alarmed. This was not the strong Spanish monarch who would anchor the Bourbon dynasty in Iberia. This was a man barely holding himself together, dependent entirely on a teenage girl who was slowly being crushed by the weight of his need. Louis XIV sent advisors, physicians, even priests, but Philip's response was always the same. He could not be separated from Maria Luisa. As the months turned into years, the physical toll on the Queen became impossible to ignore. Maria Luisa, who had arrived in Spain as a vibrant 13-year-old, began to age rapidly. By 17, she looked 30. By 20, she appeared ancient. The constant stress, the lack of sleep, the emotional burden of being the only thing standing between her husband and complete collapse. It was consuming her from within. She suffered frequent illnesses, her body weakened by the relentless demands placed upon it. Yet she never complained, never sought to escape. Perhaps she understood that Philip's survival depended on her, or perhaps she had simply accepted her fate as the price of her crown. The Queen managed to fulfill one crucial duty. She produced heirs. Between 1707 and 1714, Maria Luisa bore 4 sons who survived infancy: Louis, Philip, Ferdinand, and Charles. But even pregnancy provided no respite from her husband's obsessive attention. Philip insisted on being present during the births, a shocking breach of protocol that scandalized the court. He would pace the birthing chamber, becoming increasingly agitated with each of his wife's screams, sometimes having to be physically restrained from interfering with the midwives. After each birth, rather than allowing the Queen the traditional period of recovery and rest, Philip would demand her presence beside him within days, unable to tolerate her absence even while she recovered from the trauma of childbirth. The Spanish court, which had initially hoped Philip's marriage would stabilize him, watched in growing horror as the opposite occurred. The king showed little interest in actually governing. Documents piled up unsigned on his desk while he sat with Maria Luisa, sometimes talking, sometimes simply staring at her for hours. When forced to attend council meetings, he would become agitated if they lasted too long, his eyes constantly drifting to wherever the Queen was seated, as though she might vanish if he looked away. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments that Spain was essentially being ruled by the Queen and a handful of capable ministers. While the king existed in a state of perpetual anxiety, his entire world narrowed to the person of his wife. Then, in February 1714, Maria Luisa of Savoy died. She was just 25 years old, her body simply giving out after 13 years of carrying the impossible burden of being Philip V's sole connection to reality. The circumstances of her death remain somewhat mysterious. Official records cite an abscess following a miscarriage, but many historians believe the truth was simpler and more tragic. She died of exhaustion, her body and spirit finally surrendering after more than a decade of unrelenting strain. As she lay dying, Philip was, as always, at her side. Witnesses reported that he held her hand and wept, begging her not to leave him, his voice rising to a scream as her breathing grew shallow and finally stopped. What happened next shocked even a court that had grown accustomed to the king's eccentricities. Philip did not collapse into grief as he had when his mother died. Instead, he seemed to shatter. He refused to leave the death chamber. For 3 full days, He sat beside Maria Luisa's corpse, holding her cold hand, speaking to her as though she could still hear him. Servants who entered the room reported that the king appeared completely detached from reality, smiling occasionally, laughing at memories, asking the dead queen questions, and then answering them himself in a falsetto voice meant to imitate hers. When finally the body's decomposition could no longer be ignored and Philip was forcibly removed, he descended into a state that physicians described as complete madness. He refused all food and water, screaming that he would die and join his wife. He tore at his clothes and hair, scratched at his face until it bled, and had to be physically restrained to prevent him from harming himself. The palace was kept in darkness because Philip claimed that light burned his eyes. He would not allow his chambers to be cleaned, and the stench of unwashed flesh and human waste began to permeate the royal apartments. Spain, embroiled in the War of Spanish Succession and facing enemies on all sides, found itself effectively without a king. The crisis forced Louis XIV and the Spanish ministers into desperate action. They understood that Philip could not continue this way. The monarchy itself was at risk. But what could be done? The king was not dying. He was simply refusing to live. After much deliberation, they arrived at a solution that was as pragmatic as it was disturbing. They would find him a replacement wife, someone who could serve the function that Maria Luisa had fulfilled, someone who could be Philip's anchor and allow him to return to some semblance of functionality. The search began immediately, but this time the criteria were different. They needed someone older, stronger, capable of bearing the weight that had crushed Maria Luisa. Their choice fell on Elizabeth Farnese, the niece of the Duke of Parma. At 22, she was older than Maria Luisa had been, and by all accounts possessed a formidable personality. She was educated, strong-willed, and accustomed to the political maneuvering of Italian courts. The marriage was arranged with remarkable speed. Barely 6 months after Maria Luisa's death, Elizabeth Farnese was on her way to Spain. But what she found when she arrived would test even her considerable strength of character. Philip had emerged from his mourning chambers, but he had not recovered. He was gaunt, his eyes hollow and distant, his hands shaking with a tremor that would never fully leave him. And he had one non-negotiable demand for his new bride. When Elizabeth first met Philip, he presented her with a collection of Maria Luisa's dresses and jewelry. Through his closest advisor, he informed her that she would wear these clothes, style her hair in the same manner as his first wife, and occupy exactly the same role in his life. Elizabeth, despite her strong personality, understood immediately that she had no choice. This was not a marriage in any conventional sense. This was a role she was being hired to play, and the stability of Spain depended on her performance. So she donned the dead queen's clothes, arranged her hair in the fashion Maria Luisa had favored, and stepped into the impossible position of being both herself and a ghost simultaneously. The arrangement worked after a fashion. Philip, presented with this carefully constructed echo of his first wife, stabilized enough to resume some of his royal duties. But Elizabeth quickly discovered what Maria Luisa had learned years before. Her husband did not want a partner or even truly a companion. He wanted a mirror, a reflection, something he could cling to in the darkness that constantly threatened to overwhelm him. Like her predecessor, Elizabeth found herself unable to leave Philip's presence for more than brief moments. He demanded that she be with him constantly, that she sleep beside him, that she accompany him to every meeting and event, that she essentially have no existence separate from his. But Elizabeth Farnese was different from Maria Luisa in crucial ways. Where the younger woman had been gentle and accommodating, Elizabeth was calculating and ambitious. She recognized that her position, nightmarish as it was, also represented an opportunity. If she was to be chained to this madman every moment of the day, she would use that proximity to wield power, and she did, with remarkable effectiveness. While Philip descended further into his delusions, Elizabeth essentially ran Spain, making decisions in his name, manipulating his moods to achieve her political goals, and gradually building a power base that would make her one of the most influential queens in Spanish history. Yet power came at a terrible price. Elizabeth bore Philip 7 children, but each pregnancy occurred in the same suffocating atmosphere that had characterized Philip's first marriage. The king's obsessive need for her presence never wavered, never softened. She could not rest, could not have moments of privacy, could not escape the weight of being responsible for another human being's entire emotional existence. Letters she wrote to her family in Italy during this period reveal the strain. She described feeling like she was drowning, like every breath was an effort, like she was being slowly erased and replaced by whatever it was Philip needed her to be. As the 1720s progressed, Philip's mental state deteriorated further. The delusions that had always lurked at the edges of his consciousness began to push their way into the center. He became convinced that he was dying. Despite being in relatively good physical health, he would spend hours examining himself for signs of disease, calling physicians at all hours to inspect imaginary symptoms. When Elizabeth tried to reassure him, he would accuse her of lying, of wanting him to die so she could be free. These accusations would sometimes escalate into rages where Philip would throw objects, scream at servants, and once even struck Elizabeth across the face before collapsing in tears and begging her forgiveness. The king's hygiene, which had never been good, became truly appalling. Philip developed an aversion to bathing, claiming that water would make him ill. Months would pass without him washing his body or changing his clothes. The stench became so overpowering that courtiers would make excuses to avoid his presence, and the few who had to attend him would dose themselves with perfume and hold scented handkerchiefs to their noses. Elizabeth, forced to share his bed every night, endured conditions that would have broken most people. She wrote to her brother that she felt like she was married to a walking corpse, a thing that had the form of a man but none of the substance. Then in January 1724, Philip made a decision that shocked all of Europe. He abdicated the throne. The king announced that he was abdicating in favor of his eldest son, 17-year-old Louis, and would retire to a life of religious contemplation. Historians still debate Philip's motivations for this unprecedented act. Some believe he was genuinely exhausted and sought escape from the burdens of kingship. Others suggest it was a political maneuver orchestrated by Elizabeth, who hoped a period away from power might help her husband's mental state. But those closest to Philip believed the truth was simpler and darker. He had become convinced that remaining king was a sin, that his unworthiness was tainting the monarchy itself, and that only by giving up the crown could he find some measure of peace. The abdication brought no peace. Philip and Elizabeth retired to the palace of La Granja de San Ildefonso, a country palace Philip had built in imitation of Versailles. But away from the structured life of court, with no official duties to anchor him, Philip's grip on reality loosened further. He began keeping strange hours, wandering the palace at night while sleeping most of the day. His religious obsession intensified. He spent hours in prayer, sometimes speaking in tongues or claiming to receive visions from saints. He insisted that Elizabeth join him in these marathon prayer sessions, and she had no choice but to comply, kneeling beside him for hours until her knees bled and her back screamed with pain. Meanwhile, in Madrid, young King Louis I was attempting to rule Spain, but fate had one more cruel twist prepared. In August 1724, barely 7 months after his coronation, Louis contracted smallpox. The disease moved through his body with terrible speed, and within days it was clear he would not survive. As his son lay dying, Philip received the news with an emotion no one could quite identify. Was it grief, or was there something else? Some dark satisfaction at being proven right about the dangers of the crown. When Louis died on August 31st, 1724, the Spanish succession faced a constitutional crisis. Louis had no heir, and his younger brother Ferdinand was only 11 years old. The ministers, the church, and the nobility all arrived at the same conclusion. Philip would have to return to the throne. There was no other option. When they presented this necessity to the former king at La Granja, his reaction was bizarre. He did not protest or show any reluctance. Instead, he smiled, a strange, unsettling smile that made everyone in the room uncomfortable, and simply said that he had known God would call him back. It was as though his abdication had been an elaborate performance, a test he had set for the divine, and now he was being rewarded for his faith by being given back the very thing he had claimed to renounce. Philip's return to Madrid in September 1724 marked the beginning of the most disturbing phase of his reign. Whatever fragments of sanity had remained after Maria Luisa's death were now completely gone. The king who returned to the throne was not simply mentally ill, he was existing in an entirely different reality from everyone around him. He began dressing exclusively in monk's robes, refusing to wear royal regalia even for official functions. When foreign ambassadors arrived for formal audiences, they would find themselves being received by a figure who looked like a vagrant holy man rather than a king, sitting on the throne in dirty brown robes, his hair and beard unkempt, his fingernails long and yellowed. The king's daily routine descended into pure chaos. He refused to sleep during normal hours, insisting instead on staying awake through the night and sleeping during the day. But his nights were not spent in any productive activity. Instead, Philip would wander the palace corridors, sometimes talking to himself, sometimes singing. He had a good voice and had once enjoyed music, though now his songs were disconnected fragments of hymns and half-remembered lullabies, sometimes simply standing motionless in darkened rooms for hours at a time. Servants learned to avoid him during these nocturnal wanderings, as encountering the king in this state could be deeply disturbing. His eyes would be unfocused, and he often seemed not to recognize people he had known for years. Elizabeth Farnese, forced to maintain her constant attendance upon her husband, found her life descending into a waking nightmare. Philip's sleep schedule meant she could never rest properly. She would try to sleep during the day while he did, but he often woke suddenly and became agitated if she was not immediately present. The palace physicians, at their wits' end, tried every remedy known to medicine, more bloodletting, special diets, herbal concoctions, even at one point an early form of shock therapy involving ice baths. Nothing worked. Philip existed in his own reality, and that reality was ruled by demons only he could see. The king's delusions took increasingly bizarre forms. He became convinced that he was dying from a variety of impossible diseases. One month, he was certain his flesh was rotting from his bones, and he would spend hours examining his skin for signs of decay. The next month, he was sure that his organs were being consumed by worms, and he would describe to horrified courtiers the sensations of the creatures eating him from within. Physicians would examine him and assure him he was in perfect health, but Philip would respond with rage, accusing them of being part of a conspiracy to hide his condition from him. His hygiene deteriorated to truly shocking levels. Philip's aversion to bathing became absolute. He would scream and fight if anyone tried to wash him, claiming that water would destroy his body. Months stretched into years without him properly washing. His body became covered in sores and rashes from the constant dirt and sweat. His teeth rotted in his mouth, giving him constant pain and foul breath. His hair became matted and filled with lice. The palace servants who had to handle the king's linens and chambers reported that the stench was almost unbearable. And through it all, Elizabeth was required to share his bed, to lie beside this unwashed, delusional creature every night. Yet somehow, Spain continued to function. Elizabeth Farnese proved to be a political genius, using her husband's madness to consolidate her own power. She learned to interpret Philip's moods, to guide his delusions in directions that served her purposes, to present her decisions as his wishes. Ministers learned to bring their proposals to the Queen first, who would then present them to Philip in ways he could accept. Foreign ambassadors dealt primarily with Elizabeth, understanding that the king was merely a formality. Spain, in effect, had a queen regnant in all but name, though the fiction of Philip's rule had to be maintained. Philip's relationship with his children from both marriages was virtually non-existent. He could barely remember their names, often confusing them with each other or with children who had died in infancy. His sons learned early that their father was not someone they could approach for guidance or affection. Ferdinand, who would eventually succeed Philip as king, later wrote in his private correspondence that he felt like he had grown up without a father, that the thing that wore his father's face was something else entirely, something that frightened him on a deep, instinctual level. The king's religious mania intensified throughout the 1730s. He began claiming to receive direct communications from God, messages that he would dictate to terrified secretaries at all hours. These divine revelations ranged from the mundane to the incomprehensible. Instructions for new church holidays, commands to build monasteries, prophecies about the end times. The church, caught in an impossible position between respecting the divinely appointed king and recognizing obvious blasphemy, tried to gently discourage these visions. But Philip would fly into rages if anyone questioned the authenticity of his communications with the divine. Music became Philip's only reliable comfort during this period. The great castrato singer Farinelli was brought to court specifically to sing for the king, and these performances were the only times Philip seemed to achieve anything approaching peace. Every evening, Farinelli would sing the same 4 arias for the king, and Philip would sit motionless, tears streaming down his face, his tortured mind briefly quieted by the beauty of the human voice. This routine continued for years, with the singer essentially imprisoned in the role of the king's emotional support, much as Elizabeth was imprisoned in the role of his wife. Yet even this comfort was tinged with madness. Philip became convinced that Farinelli's voice was not human but angelic, that the singer was actually a celestial being sent to prepare him for death. As Philip entered his 60s, his body began to fail in ways his mind could not. The years of neglect, poor hygiene and constant stress took their inevitable toll. He developed painful ulcers on his legs that refused to heal. His teeth, what remained of them, caused constant agony. His hands shook so severely that he could no longer sign documents, and his signature had to be forged by trusted secretaries. Yet his mind remained trapped in its delusional prison, unable to find peace even as his body slowly shut down. The palace itself seemed to reflect the king's mental state. It became a place of whispers and shadows, where courtiers moved quietly through dimly lit corridors, where the normal sounds of a vibrant court, laughter, music, conversation, were subdued to near silence for fear of disturbing the king. Visitors from other European courts were shocked by the atmosphere. Where they expected the grandeur and energy of a great monarchy, they found something that felt more like a haunted house, with the spectre of the king at its center, a living ghost terrifying everyone around him simply by existing. Elizabeth Farnese, who had endured more than 30 years of this existence, had transformed into something beyond human. Those who saw her in Philip's final years reported that she seemed almost mechanical, going through the motions of care and devotion with no emotion visible on her face. She was 52 years old, but looked 70, her beauty long since consumed by the decades of stress and lack of sleep. Yet she maintained her position, never wavering, because to do so would mean allowing the facade to crumble, and with it, her own power and the stability of Spain itself. In July 1746, Philip V finally died at the Buen Retiro Palace in Madrid. He was 62 years old and had reigned, with his brief interruption, for 45 years, one of the longest reigns in Spanish history. The official cause of death was recorded as a stroke, but in truth, Philip's body had simply given up, worn out by decades of self-neglect and mental anguish. His death was not peaceful. In his final days, he raved constantly, speaking to people who weren't there, fighting invisible enemies, calling out for his long-dead mother and his first wife, Maria Luisa. Elizabeth was with him to the end, holding his hand as he died, though whether this was from any remaining affection or simply because that had been her role for 3 decades, no one could say. The reaction to Philip's death across Spain was complex. There was grief, certainly. He had been their king for nearly half a century, and many Spaniards had never known another monarch. But there was also an unmistakable sense of relief, a feeling that a long nightmare had finally ended. Foreign observers noted that Madrid seemed to breathe differently after Philip's death, as though the city itself had been holding its breath for 40 years and could finally exhale. The new king, Ferdinand VI, was Philip's 3rd son and proved to be a capable, rational ruler, everything his father had not been. Elizabeth Farnese lived another 20 years after Philip's death, and those who knew her remarked on the transformation. Free from the suffocating presence of her husband, she seemed to come back to life. She took up residence in La Granja and became actively involved in securing thrones for her sons in Italy, using her considerable political skills and the wealth she had accumulated. Yet she never spoke publicly about her years with Philip, maintaining a dignified silence about the true nature of her marriage. Only in private letters to her most trusted confidants did she ever hint at what she had endured, writing once that she had spent 30 years in prison and that death held no fear for her because it could not possibly be worse than what she had already survived. The Spanish court, freed from the bizarre constraints of Philip's madness, returned to something approaching normalcy under Ferdinand VI. The new king immediately ordered the royal apartments thoroughly cleaned and renovated, as though trying to scrub away every trace of his father's presence. The strange rituals that had governed court life, the constant attendance upon the king, the nocturnal wanderings, the enforced silences were abandoned. Foreign ambassadors reported that Madrid was like a different city, that the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized the court for decades had lifted almost overnight. Historians and physicians have long debated the nature of Philip's mental illness. By modern diagnostic standards, he likely suffered from a complex combination of disorders: severe anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, depression, and possibly a form of psychosis that worsened over time. His obsessive attachment to his wives suggests an attachment disorder stemming from the traumatic loss of his mother in adolescence. His later delusions and hallucinations indicate a break with reality consistent with severe mental illness, possibly exacerbated by the stress of ruling and the trauma of Maria Luisa's death. Some historians have suggested that Philip may have suffered from what we would now recognize as a form of clinical depression combined with elements of schizophrenia. The religious delusions, the hallucinations, the disordered thinking, all point to a mind that had lost its ability to distinguish between internal experience and external reality. Yet Philip lived in an era that had no understanding of mental illness as a medical condition, no treatment beyond bloodletting and prayer, and no framework for understanding that the king's behavior was the result of disease rather than moral weakness or divine punishment. What makes Philip's case particularly tragic is that he was given absolute power over millions of people despite being manifestly unfit to exercise it. The doctrine of divine right, which held that kings were appointed by God and answerable only to him, meant that Philip could not be removed from power no matter how deranged he became. The only solution was to work around him, to create systems where he could be nominally in charge while others actually made decisions. This worked well enough to keep Spain functioning, but the human cost, particularly to the 2 women who were forced to serve as his emotional support system, was immense. Maria Luisa of Savoy and Elizabeth Farnese represent 2 of history's most tragic queens. Both were intelligent, capable women who could have been remarkable monarchs in their own right. Instead, they were reduced to being living security blankets for a man who could not function without them. Maria Luisa was literally consumed by this role, dying at 25 from what was essentially exhaustion. Elizabeth survived by becoming hard as steel, sacrificing her own humanity to maintain the facade that was required of her. Neither woman was ever able to escape, to have a life separate from Philip's needs, to be anything other than what his illness required them to be. The children of Philip's marriages paid their own price for their father's madness. They grew up in an atmosphere of constant tension and fear, never knowing from one day to the next what state their father would be in. Several of them showed signs of their own mental instability, hardly surprising given both the genetic inheritance and the traumatic environment of their upbringing. The Spanish Bourbons would continue to struggle with mental illness throughout the following generations, though never quite to the extent manifested in Philip V. Philip's legacy to Spain was complex and contradictory. On one hand, his reign saw important administrative reforms, mostly implemented by capable ministers working around the king's incapacity. The Spanish economy recovered somewhat from the disasters of the late Habsburg period, and Spain maintained its status as a major European power despite the wars of Spanish succession and Polish succession. On the other hand, the kingdom was ruled for 45 years by a man who was fundamentally unable to rule, creating a culture of workarounds and informal power structures that would cause problems for future generations. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Philip's story is how many people knew about his condition and yet did nothing, or rather could do nothing, to remove him from power. Foreign ambassadors sent detailed reports back to their governments describing the king's madness. Spanish nobles gossiped openly about his bizarre behavior. The church was fully aware that Philip's religious visions were the product of mental illness. Yet the system had no mechanism for dealing with an insane king beyond waiting for him to die. The best that could be done was to manage him, to work around him, and to hope that his madness wouldn't lead to outright catastrophe. Philip's obsession with death, his constant conviction that he was dying, his morbid fascination with decay, his later habit of dressing as a monk, can be understood as a man who was, in some essential sense, already dead. He was a ghost inhabiting his own body, going through the motions of life while feeling nothing, connecting with nothing, trapped in an existence that had become unbearable, but that he lacked the will or means to escape. His actual death, when it finally came, was probably anticlimactic, the body simply catching up to what the mind had already accomplished years before. In the end, Philip III of Spain left behind no great monuments, no glorious military victories, no significant cultural achievements. His legacy was written in human suffering. 2 wives ground down by his needs, children who barely knew him, servants traumatized by exposure to his madness, a nation that learned to function despite rather than because of its monarch. He proved that you could technically be king without actually ruling, that power could be maintained through performance and protocol even when the person at the center had completely collapsed. But the cost of maintaining that fiction was paid by real people, and their suffering cannot be erased by historical hindsight or clinical diagnosis. The story of Philip V is ultimately a story about the price of power when it is held by someone fundamentally incapable of wielding it. It is a story about the invisible chains that bound 2 women to a man they could never escape, about the slow grinding down of human beings by the weight of duty and circumstance. It is a story about how history remembers kings and forgets queens, how official narratives obscure uncomfortable truths, how societies protect themselves by hiding madness behind velvet curtains and pretending everything is fine. And it is a reminder that behind every crown, every title, every page in the history books, there are real people living real lives, often in circumstances we can barely imagine and suffering in ways that leave no trace in official records but echo through the centuries nonetheless. Philip V died on July 9, 1746, but in many ways, the man his subjects thought they knew had died decades earlier, perhaps when Maria Louisa succumbed to exhaustion, or perhaps even earlier, when a 14-year-old boy stood by his mother's deathbed and felt something break inside him that would never heal. The Philip who ruled Spain was already a ghost, and his death merely made official what had been true for years. Spain's king had left the building long ago, leaving behind only a suffering, delusional creature wearing a crown it could not bear and exercising power it could not comprehend. The real tragedy is not that he lived this way, but that he had to, that the system had no room for his humanity, no capacity for mercy, only an endless demand that he perform the role of king regardless of the cost to himself or anyone unfortunate enough to love him.